The abyss below. The cold had a way of seeping into a man's bones, no matter how many layers of thermal insulation separated him from the frozen wasteland outside. Dr. Alan Whitaker adjusted his fur-lined parka, pulling the hood tighter against the wind that howled across the desolate plains of Antarctica. He stood at the entrance of the research station, gazing out over the endless expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. Nothing moved out there. Nothing could survive long in the harsh conditions of the Earth's southernmost continent. Alan was no stranger to the cold. He had spent years in Antarctica, first as a young geologist on an early expedition, now as the senior scientist at McMurdo Station. His work had always been his anchor, the one thing that kept him grounded amidst the overwhelming isolation that came with this territory. Continent was a graveyard of lost expeditions and buried secrets, and that's what drew him here more than anything. The secrets. Dr. Whitaker were picking up something strange on the scanners. The voice of a young technician crackled over the radio, breaking Alan's reverie. He turned and trudged back inside, where the warmth of the station's interior hit him like a wall. The smell of coffee and stale air was a comfort in its own way, a reminder that, despite the world outside, there was still a small pocket of civilization here. "What do you have?" Alan asked as he entered the small control room, where a team of researchers huddled around a series of monitors. "Anomalous readings about 30 miles from here," technician replied, pointing to a blinking red dot on one of the screens. "It's deep underground, but we're getting some kind of electromagnetic interference. Nothing like I've seen before." Alan leaned in closer, frowning. "Could it be volcanic activity? A magma chamber?" "Unlikely," said Dr. Sarah Collins, the station seismologist, who had been reviewing the data. "There's no sign of tectonic movement, and the interference doesn't match any known geological pattern." "What about metal deposits? Could be a large ore body reflecting signals," Alan suggested, though he knew it was a stretch. Sarah shook her head. "No, this is something else. Whatever it is, it's not natural." A shiver of excitement mixed with unease ran down Alan's spine. Antarctica was the least explored continent on Earth. There were entire mountain ranges hidden beneath the ice, lakes sealed off from the surface for millions of years, and who knew what else. But this was different. Something about those readings tugged at a buried instinct, one he had learned to trust over the years. "Let's take a closer look," Alan said, the decision made almost without conscious thought. "We'll prep the snowmobiles and head out at first light." The journey across the frozen landscape was grueling, even by Antarctic standards. The wind howled relentlessly, driving sheets of ice and snow across the barren plains. Visibility was reduced to mere feet at times, forcing the team to navigate by GPS alone. Alan led the way, his snowmobile cutting a path through the drifts, the others following in a tight formation behind him. Hours passed in a blur of white. Alan's thoughts wandered, turning over the possibilities of what they might find. The idea of discovering something truly unknown, something that defied explanation, was a powerful lure. It was why he had chosen this life, after all. Finally, the GPS indicated they were nearing the coordinates. Alan slowed his snowmobile, the others following suit as they approached what appeared to be a large ice formation. It jutted up from the ground, partially obscured by snow, its surface smooth and oddly reflective. "This is it," Alan called over the radio, dismounting from his snowmobile. The others followed, gathering around the formation with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. "It's not natural," Sarah said, running a gloved hand over the surface. "Too smooth, too uniform. And look at these patterns." Alan stepped closer, noticing the faint, imperceptible lines that crisscrossed the ice. They weren't random. They formed intricate patterns, almost like circuitry. His heart began to race. "What the hell is this?" muttered Tom, one of the engineers, as he examined the patterns. "I don't know," Alan replied, "but I intend to find out." They spent the next several hours excavating the site, using portable heaters and ice axes to chip away at the frozen surface. As they worked, more of the structure was revealed. Large, curved sections of metal-like material, though it was unlike any metal Alan had ever seen. It was dark, almost black, a strange sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Eventually, they uncovered what appeared to be an entrance. a large, oval-shaped hatch set into the side of the structure. It had no visible handle or mechanism, just a smooth surface with more of those intricate patterns. "Should we try to open it?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. Alan hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision. Whatever this thing was, it had been buried here for a long time. There was no telling what they might find inside, or what they might release. "We came all this way," he said finally. "Can't turn back now." Tom approached the hatch, examining it closely. It's seamless. No obvious way to open it. But these patterns, they look like they might be some kind of interface. "Try applying a charge," Alan suggested, his mind racing. "If it's an electronic system, it might respond to an electrical current." Tom nodded and retrieved a portable battery pack from their gear. He carefully attached a pair of leads to the surface of the hatch, then activated the pack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the patterns on the hatch began to glow faintly, a soft blue light that pulsed rhythmically. "It's working," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. The light spread across the hatch, tracing the patterns like water flowing through a series of channels. There was a soft, almost inaudible hum, and then, with a suddenness that made them all jump, the hatch slid open. A rush of cold air escaped from within, colder even than the Antarctic wind. Alan felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, primal warning that something was very wrong. But curiosity overrode caution, and he stepped forward, peering into the darkness beyond. "Everyone get your lights," he ordered, his voice steady despite the growing unease. They switched on their headlamps, illuminating the interior of the structure. The light revealed a narrow corridor, its walls made of the same strange material as the exterior. Patterns were more pronounced here. Alan led the way, moving slowly down the corridor, his breath misting in the frigid air. The floor was smooth, almost slick, and the air was heavy with a metallic tang. Corridor sloped gently downward, leading them deeper into the structure. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice echoing eerily in the confined space. "Some kind of ship? Maybe?" Alan speculated, though he couldn't be sure. The design was like nothing he had ever seen. Alien, the truest sense of the word. They continued down the corridor, the tension growing with each step. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, as if the light from their headlamps was being swallowed by the walls. Alan's mind raced with possibilities. None of them made any sense. Finally, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, and the team came to a halt. The chamber was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls lined with more of those glowing patterns. In the center of the room was a large cylindrical structure, surrounded by what looked like consoles or control panels. Alan approached the cylinder, his heart pounding. There was something inside it, something large and dark, suspended in a viscous liquid that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. He could just make out the shape of it, twisted mass of limbs and tentacles, its form indistinct but unmistakably organic. "My God," Sarah breathed, taking a step back. The thing in the cylinder was unlike anything Alan had ever seen, an abomination of nature, a nightmare made flesh. It was both fascinating and horrifying, a glimpse into a reality that defied comprehension. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice trembling. This isn't right. We shouldn't be here." The return trip to McMurdo Station was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Cold air burned their lungs, and the endless white landscape felt more oppressive than ever. Alan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see that nightmare from the ship pursuing them across the ice. There was nothing, only the howling wind and the crunch of snow under their snowmobiles. By the time they reached the station, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice. The sight of the familiar buildings brought a fleeting sense of relief. It was short-lived. The team's discovery weighed heavily on their minds, and the fear they had left behind in the frozen cavern clung to them like a second skin. Alan dismounted his snowmobile and headed straight for the main building, the others trailing behind him. The warmth of the station was a welcome reprieve, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled in his bones. He removed his parka and gloves with shaking hands, then turned to the others. "We need to secure the data," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Every bit of information we gathered down there needs to be cataloged and analyzed. Alan, we need to shut this down, Sarah interrupted, her eyes wide with fear. This isn't some geological anomaly we're dealing with. We found something that shouldn't exist. We have to warn the others, and we have to get out of here. Tom nodded in agreement. She's right. We don't know what we've awakened, and we're not equipped to deal with it. We need to contact the main research base and get an evacuation started. Alan knew they were right. His rational mind told him that the best course of action was to leave, to seal off the area and report their findings to the authorities. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to explore the frozen wastes in the first place, refused to back down. They had uncovered something extraordinary, something that could rewrite everything humanity knew about the world and the universe beyond it. To walk away now felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. I understand your concerns, he said carefully, but we need more information before we make any rash decisions. If we evacuate now, we lose our chance to study this phenomenon. We might even be able to contain it if we act quickly. Contain it? Tom echoed incredulously. You saw what happened down there. That thing was alive, and it's loose now. You can't control something like that. Alan felt a surge of frustration. We don't know that for sure. We need to analyze the data first, figure out what we're dealing with. Maybe there's a way to neutralize it. Or maybe we're just playing with fire. Dara shot back. This isn't just about science anymore, Alan. It's about survival. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Alan could see the fear in their eyes, and he couldn't blame them. He felt it too, gnawing at the edges of his mind. But the scientist in him, part that sought understanding in the face of the unknown, refused to let go. Give me a few hours, he said finally. Let me review the data, see what we're dealing with. If I determine that the threat is too great, I'll authorize an evacuation myself. But we need to know what we're up against. Sarah and Tom exchanged worried glances, but after a moment they nodded in reluctant agreement. Fine, Sarah said, her voice resigned. But if anything else happens, we're pulling the plug. Agreed, Alan replied, though he could see that it offered little comfort. With that, the group dispersed. Alan headed to the lab, his mind already racing with possibility. He needed to understand what they had found, what it was, where it came from, and most importantly, how to stop it. The others, however, remained on edge, their every movement tinged with the lingering fear, what they had unleashed. The lab was a small, cramped space, filled with computers, microscopes, and various pieces of scientific equipment. It was a familiar environment, one that usually brought Alan a sense of calm and focus. But tonight, the walls seemed to close in on him. The hum of the machines, a reminder of the unknown lurking beneath the ice. He sat down at his terminal and began uploading the data they had collected at the site. Electromagnetic readings, temperature fluctuations, structural analysis. The computer screen flickered as lines of code and graphs appeared. A torrent of information that would have taken days, if not weeks, to fully parse. But there was no time for a thorough analysis. He needed answers, and he needed them now. As he sifted through the data, one thing became increasingly clear. The structure they had uncovered was not of terrestrial origin. The materials used in its construction were unlike anything found on Earth, composed of elements and compounds that defied conventional chemistry. The electromagnetic patterns were equally baffling. Complex, almost organic in nature, as if the ship itself was a living entity. But it was the energy signatures that troubled Alan the most. The ship was still active, its systems running at minimal power, but there were fluctuations, spikes in energy levels that coincided with their movements inside the ship. It was as if the structure had responded to their presence, coming to life as they explored its depth. Alan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The implications were staggering. A vessel from another world, buried beneath the Antarctic ice for who knew how long. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the edge of his consciousness. The thing in the cylinder. It hadn't just been a specimen. It was connected to the ship, part of it in some way he couldn't yet comprehend. And when they had broken the cylinder, they had unleashed it. He returned to the energy readings, searching for any pattern, any clue that might help him understand. The more he looked, the more elusive the answers became. Energy spikes were erratic, almost like a heartbeat. No, not a heartbeat, something else, a pulse, a signal. Alan's fingers hovered over the keyboard as a chilling realization settled in. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a beacon. It had been transmitting something, perhaps even across the vast expanse of space. And by disturbing it, they might have triggered a response, either from within the ship itself or from something far, far away. He quickly began cross-referencing the data, pulling up every bit of information he could find on similar signals, anything that might provide a match. But as he worked, a creeping sense of dread began to build in his chest. Patterns were unlike anything recorded on Earth, but there was a strange familiarity to them, a rhythm that echoed in the darkest recesses of his mind. Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered, and the monitors blinked off. Alan cursed under his breath, heart pounding in his chest. Power outage? But the station's backup generators should have kicked in immediately. He waited, the silence in the lab growing thicker, heavier. Then, as abruptly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on, the monitors whirring to life. Alan's gaze snapped to the screen, where a new set of data had appeared. Data he hadn't input, data that shouldn't have been there. The readings were off the charts, the energy levels spiking to dangerous levels. And at the center of it all was a single pulsing signal. A frequency that was somehow both familiar and utterly alien. The station's comm system crackled to life, and a panicked voice came through. "Dr. Whitaker, we've got a situation. The sensors are going haywire, and we're picking up some kind of..." Transmission cut off, replaced by a burst of static that set Alan's teeth on edge. He stood up, mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and fast. Without a second thought, Alan grabbed his coat and bolted out of the lab. He needed to find the others, needed to figure out what was going on. As he ran down the corridor, the station's lights flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with something unnatural. He burst into the control room, where Sarah and Tom were already gathered, their faces pale with fear. "What's happening?" Alan demanded, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "The sensors are going crazy," Tom said, his voice tight with panic. "We're picking up massive energy surges from the site, way beyond anything we've seen before. And there's something else, some kind of signal, but it's not like anything I've ever heard." Alan didn't need to hear the signal to know what it was. The ship's pulse, the heartbeat of that alien construct, was growing stronger. And with it, so too was the presence they had unleashed. "We need to shut it down," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Whatever it is, we have to stop it before it's too late." Alan nodded, though he wasn't sure how they could possibly achieve that. The ship was beyond their understanding, its technology alien to anything on Earth. But they had no choice. They didn't act, the consequences could be catastrophic. "There's an emergency shutdown protocol," Alan said, thinking quickly. "We can reroute the station's power to overload the ship's systems, maybe disrupt the signal long enough to..." A loud metallic clang echoed through the station, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sound reverberated through the walls, sending a shiver down Alan's spine. "The hell was that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could respond, the station's lights went out again, plunging them into darkness. This time, the backup generators didn't kick in. The only light came from the dim glow of their monitors and the emergency lights that flickered weakly in the corridors. Alan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The station was failing. No, it was being attacked. Whatever they had awoken, it was trying to shut them down, to stop them from interfering. "We have to move, now," Alan said. "We need to get to the main control panel and initiate the shutdown manually." They didn't wait for further instruction. Alan led the way through the darkened corridors, the others close behind. The station felt different now, alien, as if it had become an extension of the ship they had uncovered. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolence, every sound a threat. As they rounded a corner, Alan caught sight of something moving in the distance, just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. It was fast, a blur of motion that vanished almost as soon as he saw it. "Did you see that?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. "Keep moving," Alan replied, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "We're almost there." They reached the main control room, the door sliding open with a hiss. Alan wasted no time, rushing to the central console and pulling up the station's power grid. His hands shook as he navigated the system, rerouting power to overload the ship's system. Come on," he muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The room was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the equipment. Sarah and Tom stood guard by the door, their eyes scanning the darkness outside for any sign of movement. Finally, Alan found the command he was looking for. He took a deep breath and initiated the shutdown sequence. The lights on the console flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire station was holding its breath. Then the power surged. The lights brightened for a brief, blinding moment before everything went dark. The hum of the equipment died, replaced by a deep, resonant vibration that Alan could feel in his bones. And then, the signal stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Alan held his breath, waiting for anything to happen. But the station remained dark and still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting ever so slightly. "Did it work?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan didn't answer right away. He could still feel the tension in the air, the sense that something was wrong. The signal was gone, and the ship, whatever it was, had gone quiet. "I think so," he said finally, though the words felt hollow. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay in the station. It's too dangerous." Tom nodded in agreement. "We should head for the surface, signal for evacuation. With the power down, the temperature's going to drop fast." Alan was about to respond when the console in front of him flickered back to life. He stared at it in disbelief. There was no power. The station's systems should have been offline. But the screen glowed with an unnatural light, displaying a series of symbols that Alan didn't recognize. Before he could react, the symbols shifted, rearranging themselves into a pattern that sent a chill down his spine. It was the same pattern they had seen on the ship, the same alien design that had pulsed with energy. And then, the console spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense. The sound was a low, vibrating hum that resonated in the back of Alan's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. He could feel it more than hear it, like a pressure building inside his skull. The others heard it too. He could see it in their faces, the way their eyes widened in shock and fear. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire room, reverberating off the walls like a chorus of whispers. Alan clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The hum burrowed deeper into his mind, planting thoughts and images that weren't his own. He saw flashes of alien landscapes, towering structures that defied the laws of physics, and beings, horrible, twisted creatures that writhed in the shadows. And then, the message came through. Clear and unmistakable. "We are coming." The words burned into Alan's mind, searing themselves into his consciousness. He gasped, stumbling back from the console as the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The ship had been a beacon, a signal sent across the stars, and now it had been answered. "We need to go," Alan said, his voice hoarse with fear. "Now." They didn't need to be told twice. The group bolted from the control room, the station's once familiar corridors now twisted and alien. The lights flickered sporadically, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. As they ran, the humming sound persisted, growing louder, more intense. Alan could feel it pressing in on him from all sides, physical force trying to crush him. The images in his mind became more vivid, more horrifying. An invasion, a dark tide sweeping across the earth, consuming everything in its path. They reached the exit and burst out into the frigid night. Cold air, a shocking contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the station. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way to the communication tower, their breath visible in the freezing air. Alan could see the stars above, old and indifferent, their light barely piercing the darkness. He knew they didn't have much time. Whatever was coming, it was already on its way. "We need to send a distress signal," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to warn the others. Get help." Alan nodded and activated the tower's transmitter. His hands shook as he keyed in the emergency code, sending a signal out across the frozen wasteland. tower hummed to life, signal cutting through the static that filled the airwaves. But even as he sent the message, Alan knew it was futile. The images in his mind had shown him what was coming, something beyond human understanding, something that couldn't be stopped. The sky above them seemed to darken, the stars winking out one by one as if something massive was moving through the void, blotting out the light. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening now, and Alan could feel the pressure building in his head, threatening to tear him apart. And then they saw it. A dark shape on the horizon, moving through the night like a storm cloud, but with an unnatural, deliberate motion. It was massive, a shadow that swallowed the sky, and it was heading straight for them. "Oh my God," Tom whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Alan stared at the approaching darkness, his mind numb with terror. The thing in the ship had been a harbinger, a warning of what was to come, and now the real threat was here. He turned to the others, his heart pounding in his chest. "We have to move. Now." They scrambled down the icy slope, their movements frantic and desperate. The cold bit into their skin, but the fear driving them forward was stronger than any discomfort. The shape in the sky loomed larger, blotting out the stars, its sheer size incomprehensible. Alan didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between them and the approaching darkness as possible. But deep down, he knew it was a hopeless effort. There was no escaping what was coming. They reached the snowmobiles, and Alan threw himself onto his, the engine roaring to life beneath him. The others did the same, and they took off across the ice, the wind whipping at their faces as they sped into the night. The sky above them rumbled with a deep, resonant sound, like the growl of some ancient, titanic beast. The ground trembled beneath their snowmobiles, cracks spiderwebbing across the ice as if the very earth was trying to pull itself apart. Alan kept his eyes forward, focused on the path ahead, but the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. The darkness behind them was closing in, an unstoppable force that would consume everything in its path. They sped across the ice, the world around them a blur of white and black. The snowmobile engines roared, the only sound that could be heard over the deafening hum that filled the air. But no matter how fast they went, the darkness was faster, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Alan's thoughts raced, 1,000 different scenarios flashing through his mind, but none of them offered any hope. The thing they had awoken, force that was coming for them, was beyond anything they could comprehend. It was ancient, powerful, and utterly merciless. It was here. The sky above them split open with a blinding flash of light, and the ground beneath them buckled. Alan was thrown from his snowmobile, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He rolled across the ice, coming to a stop in a snowdrift, his vision swimming. He struggled to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The others were scattered around him, some trying to get up, others lying still in the snow. The darkness was almost upon them now, a massive, shifting void that devoured the light. Alan's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked up at the sky. The light from the rift above was pulsing, growing brighter, but it wasn't a natural light. It was cold, harsh, like the glare of an open wound in the fabric of reality itself. And from that rift, something was emerging. It was impossible to describe, an amorphous, shifting mass of darkness and light, constantly changing shape, as if it couldn't decide what form to take. It was vast, stretching out across the sky like a living shadow, its presence a physical weight pressing down on them. Alan felt his mind teetering on the edge of madness as he stared at the entity. It was beyond comprehension, a being of such immense power and malice that it defied all logic, all understanding. The images in his mind, the visions that had plagued him, were nothing compared to the reality of what stood before him. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, until it was all-encompassing. Alan could feel it in his bones, vibrating through his very being, as if the entity was resonating with the deepest parts of him, pulling him apart at the seams. The others were screaming, their voices lost in the cacophony. Alan wanted to scream too, but the sound was caught in his throat, strangled by the overwhelming presence of the entity. He could feel it inside his mind, probing, searching, and finding every fear, every doubt, every weakness. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a feeling. a deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped into the very core of his being. It was a sensation of absolute hopelessness, of despair so profound that it eclipsed everything else. The entity wasn't just going to destroy them, it was going to consume them, erase them from existence. Alan's vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the entity, looming above them, its form shifting and twisting in ways that made his mind ache. And then, there was nothing. Alan awoke to silence. He was lying on his back, staring up at a sky that was no longer dark, but a pale, washed-out gray. Cold bit into his skin, a reminder that he was still alive, though he wasn't sure how. The memories of what had happened were hazy, like a nightmare that was slipping away with the morning light. He sat up slowly, his body aching from the ordeal. The landscape around him was barren, a wasteland of ice and snow stretching out in every direction. The station was gone, as were the others. Alan was alone. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The wind howled across the frozen plain, carrying with it a sense of emptiness that mirrored the void he felt inside. He tried to remember what had happened, but the details were elusive, like shadows dancing just out of reach. There had been something, a presence, a force of unimaginable power. But it was gone now, leaving behind only silence and desolation. Alan started walking, though he had no idea where he was going. Cold was relentless, sapping his strength with every step. But he kept moving, driven by a need to find answers, to understand what had happened. As he walked, the landscape began to change. The ice beneath his feet grew smoother, more polished, reflecting the gray sky above like a mirror. The wind died down, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed in on him from all sides. In the distance, he saw something, a dark shape against the horizon. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but as he approached, it grew larger, more distinct. It was a structure, though its design was alien, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was the ship. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through him, but also a strange sense of relief. He wasn't alone, not entirely. The ship was still here, a remnant of the nightmare that had consumed his life. But as he drew closer, he realized something was different. The ship was damaged, its sleek surface marred by deep gashes and cracks. It looked ancient, weathered, as if it had been here for millennia. Alan approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship loomed above him, its dark surface absorbing the weak light of the sky. He reached out to touch it, but hesitated, a deep sense of dread holding him back. And then he heard it. A faint, distant hum, barely audible over the silence. It was coming from inside the ship, a sound that resonated with something deep inside him. The same hum he had heard before, but weaker now, fading. Without thinking, Alan moved toward the ship's entrance. The hatch was open, the interior dark and foreboding. He stepped inside, cold air rushing past him as he crossed the threshold. The interior was as he remembered it. Dark, metallic, and strangely organic. The walls were lined with those same glowing patterns, though their light was dim, flickering like a dying flame. He followed the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The ship felt different now, less alive, more like a tomb. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was gone. All that remained was a heavy, oppressive silence. The corridor led him to the chamber, the same one where they had found the cylinder. But the chamber was empty now. The cylinder shattered, contents gone. The liquid that had filled it had dried, leaving only dark stains on the floor. Alan stood in the center of the room, his mind racing. The ship was dead, its life force extinguished. But what had happened? Where was the entity that had emerged from the rift? What had become of the others? As he stood there, the hum grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from below, from somewhere deep within the ship. Alan hesitated, fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. But he knew he had to go deeper, find the source of the sound. Found a stairwell leading down, steps descending into darkness. The air grew colder as he descended, the hum vibrating through the walls, through his very bones. It was stronger here, more focused, as if he was nearing its source. At the bottom of the stairwell, he found another corridor, narrower than the first. The walls were different here, smoother, almost polished, and the light was brighter, though it still had that sickly green hue. The corridor ended in a large, circular chamber, and at its center was a massive, pulsating sphere of light. It was suspended in mid-air, its surface rippling with energy. The hum was coming from the sphere, a deep, resonant sound that filled the entire chamber. Alan approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the sphere. It was beautiful in a way, mesmerizing. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. The light it emitted was cold, devoid of warmth, and it seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. As he drew closer, the hum intensified, vibrating through his entire body. Light from the sphere grew brighter, more intense, until it was almost blinding. Alan shielded his eyes, but the light penetrated his eyelids, burning into his mind. And then the sphere spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense, but a feeling, an emotion that resonated deep within him. It was a feeling of infinite loneliness, isolation so profound that it transcended time and space. The sphere was alive, in a way, a sentient being trapped within the ship, waiting for millennia in the frozen depths of Antarctica. It had reached out across the stars, searching for something, someone, to release it from its prison. And Alan had answered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a prison, a tomb for a being of unimaginable power. And by disturbing it, by breaking the cylinder and releasing the entity, he had set in motion events that could not be undone. The sphere pulsed with light, its energy surging as it reached out to him, trying to communicate. Images flashed through his mind. Alien worlds, civilizations long dead, and the dark, formless void that lay beyond the stars. The entity was showing him its history, its origins. It had once been a being of light, a creature of immense power and knowledge. But it had been betrayed, trapped by its own kind and cast out into the void, where it had drifted for eons before crashing to Earth. It had lain dormant beneath the ice, its power sealed within the ship, waiting for the day when it could be freed. But now, it was awake, and its hunger for freedom, for revenge, was all-consuming. Alan felt the entity's will pressing down on him, force so overwhelming that it threatened to crush him. It was demanding something from him, something he wasn't sure he could give. But as the images in his mind grew more intense, more desperate, he realized what it wanted. It wanted him to join it. The entity had been alone for so long, trapped in the darkness, its mind slowly unraveling. It was a creature of light, but it had become something else, something twisted and malevolent. It needed a host, a vessel to escape its prison, to return to the stars. And it had chosen Alan. The realization filled him with terror, but also a strange, sick sense of inevitability. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. The entity was inside him, its will merging with his own, its power surging through his veins. He could feel it deep inside, presence that was both alien and familiar. It was part of him now, and he was part of it. Their minds were linked, their thoughts intertwined, and for a brief moment, Alan saw the universe through the entity's eyes. It was vast, incomprehensible, filled with wonders and horrors beyond human understanding. But it was also empty, a void that stretched on forever, devoid of warmth, life. And in that moment, Alan understood the entity's loneliness, its desperation to escape the darkness. But he also understood something else, something that filled him with a deep, unshakable dread. The entity wasn't just trying to escape, it was trying to consume. It had been trapped for so long, its hunger growing with each passing eon. And now that it was free, it would stop at nothing to satisfy that hunger. It would consume worlds, civilizations, entire galaxies, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. And it would start with Earth. Alan's mind recoiled from the thought, but the entity's will was too strong, too overwhelming. It was inside him now, its power coursing through his veins, its thoughts merging with his own. And then, with a final surge of energy, the entity took control. Alan's body stiffened, his mind going blank as the entity's consciousness flooded his own. He was no longer in control. He was a passenger, a vessel for something far greater than himself. The sphere pulsed one last time, its light flaring brilliantly before it was absorbed into Alan's body. He felt a surge of power, a rush of energy that filled him with a sense of invincibility, of godlike strength. But it was fleeting, a mere taste of what was to come. The entity was still growing, still gathering its strength, and soon it would be ready to unleash its full power. Alan's body moved on its own, guided by the entity's will. He walked out of the chamber, his steps steady and purposeful, his mind a blank canvas. The ship's corridors were no longer dark and foreboding. They were alive with energy, pulsing with the entity's presence. He reached the surface, the cold air biting into his skin, but he didn't feel it. The entity's power shielded him, protected him from the elements. The sky above was still gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The darkness that had consumed the world was gone. Alan stood at the edge of the ice field, staring out at the horizon. The entity was inside him now, its thoughts merging with his own, its power surging through his veins. It was a part of him, and he was a part of it. But even as the entity's will pressed down on him, Alan felt a small spark of resistance, a fragment of his own consciousness that refused to be extinguished. It was weak, barely more than a flicker, but it was there, a reminder of who he had been. And in that moment, as the entity's power surged through him, Alan made a choice. He wouldn't let the entity consume him, wouldn't let it destroy everything he had ever known and loved. He would fight, resist, even if it meant his own destruction. Because he knew, deep down, that there were some things worth fighting for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The entity sensed his resistance, its will pressing down on him with renewed force. But Alan held on, clinging to that small spark of defiance, refusing to let it go. And as the wind howled around him and the sky darkened once more, Alan prepared for the final battle. A battle not just for his own soul, but for the fate of the entire world. The battle was fought in the space of a single heartbeat, but it stretched on for an eternity. Alan's mind was a battlefield, a war zone where two wills clashed, each struggling for dominance. The entity was powerful, ancient, a force of nature that had existed for millennia. Its will was like a tidal wave, crashing down on Alan's consciousness, trying to drown him, to erase him from existence. But Alan was determined, his resolve hardened by the knowledge of what was at stake. He couldn't let the entity win, couldn't let it unleash its darkness upon the world. He fought back with everything he had, every ounce of strength, every fragment of his identity. The battle raged on, a mental tug-of-war that threatened to tear Alan's mind apart. The entity's will was relentless, its power overwhelming, but Alan held on, refusing to give in. He could feel the entity's frustration, its anger at his defiance. It had expected an easy victory, a swift conquest of his mind and body. But Alan was stronger than it had anticipated, more resilient. And in that moment, Alan realized something that gave him hope. The entity wasn't invincible. It was powerful, yes, but it wasn't all-knowing. It had been trapped for so long, isolated from the world, that it had grown arrogant, complacent. It had underestimated him, and that was its weakness. With renewed determination, Alan pressed the attack, pushing back against the entity's will. He focused on his memories, his experiences, everything that made him who he was. He visualized his family, his friends, the people he loved, the things he cared about. The entity recoiled at the onslaught, its grip on his mind weakening. Alan could feel it struggling, trying to reassert control, but he didn't let up. He pushed harder, driving the entity back, forcing it to retreat. The battle was fierce, intense, but slowly, surely, Alan began to gain the upper hand. The entity's will was strong, but it was also fragmented, disjointed. It had been alone for so long that it had forgotten how to fight, how to adapt. Alan used that to his advantage, exploiting every weakness, every flaw. He chipped away at the entity's defenses, breaking down its will piece by piece. It was a slow, grueling process, but he was making progress. And then finally he found it. Core of the entity's power, the source of its strength, was buried deep within his mind, a dark, pulsating mass of energy that radiated malice and hatred. It was the heart of the entity, the wellspring of its power, and it was vulnerable. Alan knew what he had to do. He gathered all of his strength, all of his willpower, and directed it at the core. Poured everything he had into the attack, focusing all of his energy on a single decisive blow. The entity sensed the danger, its will flaring in a last-ditch effort to stop him. But it was too late. Alan's attack struck the core with the force of a hurricane, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The entity screamed, a sound that reverberated through Alan's mind, a wail of pure agony and despair. Its power exploded outward, a shockwave that rippled through his consciousness, shaking the very foundations of his mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, It was over. The entity's presence faded, its power dissipating into nothingness. The darkness that had consumed Alan's mind was gone, replaced by a blinding light that filled every corner of his consciousness. Alan gasped, his body shuddering as he was flooded with a sense of relief. Freedom. The entity was gone, its hold on him broken, its power extinguished. He was free. But even as he celebrated his victory, Alan knew that the battle wasn't over. The entity's power had been vast, and its destruction had left a void in his mind, a gaping wound that throbbed with pain. He could feel it, the emptiness, the void that the entity had left behind. It was a deep, aching loneliness, a sense of loss that threatened to consume him. But Alan didn't let it. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to give in now. He focused on his memories, his experiences, the things that mattered to him. He filled the void with light, with hope, with love. And slowly the wound began to heal. The light in his mind dimmed, fading to a soft glow. The pain receded, replaced by a sense of calm, of peace. Alan could feel his strength returning, his mind clearing. He opened his eyes, blinking against the bright light of the sky. The gray clouds had parted, revealing a clear blue expanse above. The sun was shining, its warmth cutting through the cold, banishing the darkness that had lingered in the air. Alan took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, clean air. He was alive. He had won. But even as he stood there, basking in the sunlight, Alan knew that things would never be the same. The entity was gone, but its influence, its darkness, would linger. The world had changed, and so had he. He had faced the abyss, stared into the void, and emerged victorious, but the cost had been high, and the scars would remain. Alan turned, looking out across the frozen landscape. The ship was gone, vanished without a trace, as if it had never existed. The ice stretched out before him, a pristine, untouched wilderness. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He would face them, just as he had faced the entity. Because he was stronger now, stronger than he had ever been. And no matter what the future held, he would be ready. With a final glance at the horizon, Alan turned and began to walk, his footsteps crunching in the snow. The wind whispered around him, carrying with it a sense of possibility, new beginnings. And as he walked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, belief that, no matter what, he would find his way. Because he had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, and that, he knew, was a victory worth fighting for.